A woman in Ukraine in 1933 was caught with a handful of grain she'd hidden from Soviet collectors. The punishment wasn't arrest, it wasn't a fine. The local Communist Party committee took her 3 children, ages 2, 4, and 6, locked them in a shed and let them starve to death while she watched through a window. She could hear them crying for food. She could see them getting weaker. She couldn't do anything. They died over the course of 2 weeks, while guards made sure she witnessed every moment. This wasn't random cruelty. This was policy, deliberate, systematic, ordered from Moscow. In 1932 and 1933, Joseph Stalin's Soviet government seized every scrap of food from Ukraine. They took the grain from the fields. They took the seed grain farmers needed for next year's planting. They took the livestock. They took the hidden reserves. They searched homes for buried potatoes. They posted guards to prevent people from leaving, and they watched millions of Ukrainians starve to death. Between 4 and 7 million people died. That's more than the population of Ireland, more than the population of Norway. An entire generation of Ukrainians was murdered through deliberate starvation. It wasn't a natural famine. Weather was normal. Harvests were good. There was plenty of food. The Soviet government just took all of it, sealed the borders, and waited for the Ukrainians to die. They called it collectivization. They called it progress. They called it building socialism. It was genocide by starvation. And for decades, the Soviet Union denied it happened. Western intellectuals who knew about it covered it up. And Russia still refuses to call it what it was. This is the Holodomor, the terror famine. The mass murder by starvation that killed millions. The genocide the world tried to forget. And it explains why Ukraine is fighting so hard today. Because they know what Russia is capable of. They've seen it before. Ukraine in the 1920s was the breadbasket of Europe. Fertile black soil, abundant harvests. Ukraine produced more grain than any other region in the Soviet Union. Ukrainian farmers were productive, skilled, and independent-minded. And that was a problem for Stalin. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they promised land to the peasants. After the Russian Civil War ended in 1922, Lenin's new economic policy allowed some private farming. Ukrainian farmers prospered. They grew crops. They sold surpluses. They became relatively well off compared to farmers in Russia. This created a class the Soviets called kulaks, supposedly wealthy peasants who exploited others. In reality, kulak meant any farmer who was successful enough to hire occasional help or own more than one cow. It was a deliberately vague term used to target anyone the party wanted to eliminate. Stalin came to power in the late 1920s and decided the Soviet Union needed rapid industrialization. That required capital. Where would the money come from? Stalin's solution? Squeeze the peasants, seize their grain, export it for hard currency, use the profits to build factories. Never mind that this would starve the people producing the grain. They were expendable. Stalin also had a political problem. Ukrainian peasants resisted collectivization more than Russian peasants. They had a tradition of independence. They had national identity. They spoke Ukrainian, not Russian. They resented Moscow's control. Stalin decided to solve both problems at once. Collectivize Ukrainian agriculture by force, seize the grain to fund industrialization, and crush Ukrainian nationalism in the process. The result was the Holodomor, the killing by hunger. In 1929, Stalin launched forced collectivization. Private farms were abolished. All land, livestock, and equipment were seized and consolidated into collective farms, kolkhozes, controlled by the Communist Party. Farmers who resisted were labeled kulaks and deported to labor camps in Siberia or executed. Between 1929 and 1932, approximately 1.8 million people were deported from Ukraine. Entire villages were emptied. Families were given hours to pack and were shipped in cattle cars to the frozen north. Most died in the camps. The ones who remained were forced onto collective farms. They no longer owned their land. They worked for the state. The state owned the harvest. The state decided what to plant and when. Farmers who'd worked the land for generations were now laborers following orders from Communist Party bureaucrats who knew nothing about agriculture. Productivity collapsed. Farmers had no incentive to work hard when the state took everything. Equipment broke and wasn't replaced. Livestock died from neglect. The collective farm system was catastrophically inefficient. But Stalin didn't care about efficiency. He cared about control and extraction. In 1932, Stalin set impossibly high grain quotas for Ukraine. The quotas exceeded what Ukrainian farms could produce, even in good years. They were designed to be impossible to meet. When farms couldn't meet the quotas, Stalin's response was to take everything anyway. Grain collection brigades, armed Communist Party activists backed by secret police, swept through Ukrainian villages. They searched every building. They dug up floors looking for hidden grain. They confiscated all food, wheat, barley, potatoes, vegetables, livestock, even family gardens. Farmers who'd grown the grain were left with nothing. Not enough to eat, not enough to plant next year's crop, nothing. And it got worse. In August 1932, the Soviet government passed the Law of 5 Stalks of Grain. It made theft of state property, including picking up grain stalks from a harvested field, punishable by death or 10 years in a labor camp. Farmers who'd just had their entire harvest confiscated were now forbidden from gleaning leftover grain from their own fields. People caught with a handful of grain were shot or sent to the gulags. Children picking up kernels were arrested. The law was enforced with extreme brutality. Then in January 1933, the Soviet government sealed Ukraine's borders. Internal passports were required to leave. Checkpoints were established on roads and railways. Ukrainian peasants were forbidden from traveling to other regions to find food. They were trapped. No food, no way to leave, no way to get help. Stalin had created a death zone, and he waited for the Ukrainians to starve. The starvation was methodical, agonizing, and absolute. When humans are deprived of food, the body begins consuming itself. First, it burns fat reserves. Then it breaks down muscle tissue. Eventually, it starts consuming vital organs. The process takes weeks or months, and every stage is torture. The symptoms of starvation are horrific and follow a predictable progression. Extreme weight loss comes first. Adults losing 40, 50, 60 pounds in weeks. Bones become visible through skin. Faces become skeletal. Arms and legs thin to the point where they look like they'll snap. Swelling from edema as the body retains fluid. This is one of the cruelest symptoms because people look like they're gaining weight, but they're actually dying. Their bellies swell. Their faces puff up. Skin stretches tight over bones and fluid. Children's bellies would become grotesquely distended, not from fullness, but from fluid retention and organ failure. They looked bloated, but were actually in the final stages of starvation. Skin changes are dramatic. It becomes dry, cracked, and papery. Wounds don't heal. Infections spread easily because the immune system has shut down. Hair falls out in clumps. Teeth loosen and fall out because the body is breaking down the jawbone for minerals. Gums bleed constantly. Constant weakness and exhaustion. People couldn't walk more than a few steps without collapsing. They couldn't work. They couldn't care for children. They couldn't even get up to use the bathroom. They'd lie in bed or on the floor, too weak to move, waiting to die. The cold was unbearable. Starvation destroys the body's ability to regulate temperature. People would freeze in their homes even with fires burning. They couldn't stay warm no matter how many blankets they piled on. Ukrainian winters are brutal, -20, -30 degrees Celsius. Starving people died from hypothermia in their own beds. Mental effects were devastating. Starvation causes cognitive impairment, hallucinations, and psychological breakdown. People became disoriented. They forgot where they were. They forgot their families' names. They forgot they had children. The brain, deprived of glucose, begins shutting down. Higher functions go first. Reasoning, memory, personality. What remains is just biological panic and desperation. Parents would watch their children die slowly over weeks. First, the children would stop playing. Then they'd stop talking. Then they'd stop moving. They'd just lie there, too weak to cry, staring at nothing while their parents watched helplessly. When the child finally died, the parents often didn't have strength to bury them. Bodies would remain in homes for days or weeks. Some parents deliberately gave their last food to their children, choosing to die so the children might survive a few days longer. It rarely worked. The children usually died anyway, just a few days after their parents. Entire families would be found dead in their homes, arranged in beds, looking like they'd gone to sleep. The orphans were the most heartbreaking. Children whose parents had died would wander from village to village, begging for food. They'd eat anything: grass, bark, dirt, leather. They'd beg at every door. Most were turned away because everyone was starving. These children would eventually collapse by the roadside and die alone. Soviet officials would find their bodies and dispose of them in mass graves without identifying them. And then came the cannibalism. When there's no food left, humans resort to eating anything. People ate grass, tree bark, and dirt. They ate acorns, roots, and weeds. They ate dogs, cats, and rats. They ate leather shoes, boiled for hours. They ate belts, harnesses, and saddles. They ate the dead. The dead were everywhere. In homes, in the streets, in fields. Bodies lying where they'd fallen. Soviet authorities couldn't remove them fast enough. And starving people looked at those corpses and saw food. At first, it was corpses of strangers. Then it was neighbors. Then family members. Survivors reported eating their dead relatives because there was literally nothing else. This wasn't choice. It was biology overriding humanity. And eventually, some ate the living. There are documented cases of parents eating their own children, of children being kidnapped and killed for meat, of human flesh being sold at markets under the guise of other meat. Soviet secret police reports from 1933 document over 2,500 cases of cannibalism in Ukraine alone. The real number was almost certainly higher because most cases were never reported. One documented case involved a woman who killed her two young children, cooked their bodies, and fed the meat to her older children without telling them what it was. When authorities discovered what happened, she said she chose which children to kill based on who was weakest and most likely to die anyway. She thought she was saving the stronger ones. The Soviet police shot her. Another case involved a group of men who organized hunts for children in abandoned villages. They'd capture children who were alone, kill them, butcher the bodies, and distribute the meat among themselves. They were caught when one man tried to sell human flesh at a market. The entire group was executed. This wasn't because Ukrainians were barbaric or evil. This was what happens when the state deliberately starves millions of people. Starvation destroys human psychology. It reduces people to biological desperation. The Soviet government created conditions where cannibalism became a survival strategy for people who'd lost their humanity to hunger. And they knew it was happening. Soviet officials reported the cannibalism to Moscow. Regional Communist Party leaders sent detailed reports documenting cases. They requested permission to provide food relief to stop the cannibalism. Stalin's response was to crack down harder on anyone caught with food, not to provide relief. He ordered more aggressive grain requisitions. He ordered harsher penalties for theft of state property. He did everything except feed the starving people. Villages were dying. Entire families would starve in their homes. When spring came in 1933, there were villages where every single person had died, houses full of corpses, fields unplanted, because everyone who could work them was dead. The Soviet government sent teams to collect the bodies. They loaded corpses onto wagons and buried them in mass graves. Sometimes they didn't bother burying them, just left them in piles to decompose. And through all of this, Ukraine was still exporting grain. While millions starved, the Soviet Union was selling Ukrainian grain abroad for hard currency. Trains full of grain rolled past starving villages. Grain elevators were full, while people died of hunger in the streets outside. This wasn't a famine caused by shortage. This was deliberate murder by starvation. The food existed. The state just chose to export it instead of feeding the people who grew it. Between 4 and 7 million Ukrainians died in the Holodomor. The exact number is unknown because the Soviet government destroyed records and falsified statistics. Entire villages disappeared. Birth rates plummeted. The demographic impact was catastrophic and permanent. For comparison, The Armenian genocide killed approximately 1.5 million people. The Rwandan genocide killed approximately 800,000 people. The Cambodian genocide killed approximately 1.7 to 2 million people. The Holodomor's death toll exceeded all of these, but most people have never heard of it. Why? Because the Soviet Union covered it up, and Western governments and intellectuals helped them do it. During the Holodomor, Stalin banned foreign journalists from entering Ukraine. He knew what was happening and didn't want the world to see. A few journalists managed to get in and report what they witnessed. Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist, traveled to Ukraine in March 1933 and saw the starvation firsthand. He wrote articles describing villages full of corpses and people dying in the streets. He told the world that millions were starving while the Soviet government denied it. The Soviet government expelled him and pressured Western media to discredit his reporting. Walter Duranty, the New York Times Moscow correspondent, wrote articles denying the famine existed. He claimed Jones was exaggerating. He wrote that conditions in the Soviet Union were improving. He portrayed Stalin's policies as necessary for progress. Duranty knew he was lying. He'd seen evidence of the famine, but he had privileged access to Stalin and the Soviet government. Reporting the truth would have meant losing that access. So he lied. Duranty won a Pulitzer Prize in 1932 for his reporting on the Soviet Union. The New York Times has never revoked it, despite acknowledging his reporting was false. Gareth Jones was proven right, but by the time the truth came out, millions were already dead. Jones himself died in 1935 under suspicious circumstances while reporting in Mongolia, possibly murdered by Soviet agents. The cover-up continued for decades. The Soviet Union denied the Holodomor happened. They claimed any deaths were from natural famine, not government policy. They suppressed information. They falsified records. They punished anyone who spoke about it. And Western intellectuals helped. British socialists like George Bernard Shaw visited the Soviet Union on guided tours and reported that everyone was well-fed and happy. They didn't see the Ukrainian countryside. They didn't see the mass graves. They saw what Stalin wanted them to see, and they reported it as truth. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia continued denying the Holodomor was deliberate. They acknowledge a famine occurred, but claim it was unintentional, a result of bad weather, poor planning, and gulag sabotage. This is a lie. The evidence is overwhelming. The grain requisition quotas were impossibly high and deliberately set to be unachievable. The law of 5 stalks criminalized gleaning, ensuring people couldn't survive on leftovers. The border closures prevented Ukrainians from fleeing to find food. The continued grain exports while millions starved proves food was available. Internal Soviet documents show officials reported mass starvation to Moscow and were ordered to continue requisitions anyway. This wasn't incompetence, this was policy. Stalin deliberately starved Ukraine to crush resistance to collectivization and suppress Ukrainian nationalism. In 2006, Ukraine officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide. Over 20 countries have recognized it as genocide, including the United States, Canada, Australia, and most of Europe. Russia refuses. They claim calling it genocide is anti-Russian propaganda. They insist it was a general famine that affected everyone, not a targeted campaign against Ukrainians. This denial continues today. Russian propaganda claims Ukraine falsifies the history of the Holodomor to justify anti-Russian sentiment. Russian media downplays the death toll. Russian officials accuse Ukraine of exaggerating for political purposes. Why does Russia deny it? Because admitting the Holodomor was genocide means admitting the Soviet Union, and by extension, Russia as its successor state, committed mass murder. It means acknowledging that Stalin was a mass murderer. It means accepting responsibility for one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Russia won't do that. So they deny, deflect, and accuse others of distorting history. The Holodomor explains why Ukraine fights so hard against Russian aggression today. Ukrainians know what Russian-imposed rule looks like. They've experienced it. They watched their great-grandparents starve while the Soviet government exported their food and denied anything was wrong. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022, Ukrainians saw it as an existential threat, not just a territorial dispute, not just a political disagreement, an existential threat to their survival as a people, because they know what Russia is capable of. They know Russia will deny its crimes while committing them. They know Russia will lie about mass murder and expect the world to believe it. The Holodomor isn't ancient history to Ukrainians. It's living memory. There are still survivors. There are still families who lost entire branches to starvation. There are still villages that never recovered their pre-Holodomor populations. And Russia's denial of the Holodomor tells Ukrainians that Russia hasn't changed, that Russian imperialism is still willing to sacrifice millions of Ukrainians for political goals, that Ukrainian lives don't matter to Moscow. That's why Ukraine is fighting, because the alternative is subjugation to a state that starved millions of Ukrainians to death and still won't admit it happened. The Holodomor proves that governments can commit genocide without gas chambers or firing squads. They can kill millions by simply taking their food and preventing them from leaving. Starvation as a weapon is invisible. There are no dramatic images of violence. Just people slowly dying in their homes. Just empty villages and unmarked mass graves. Just demographic collapse that takes generations to recover from. And it's deniable. Natural famines happen. Weather causes crop failures. The perpetrators can claim it was an accident, a miscalculation, an unfortunate consequence of necessary policies. They can blame the victims for resisting progress. They can hide behind bureaucratic language about grain requisitions and collectivization. But the evidence doesn't lie. The Holodomor was deliberate. Stalin set policies he knew would cause mass starvation. His officials reported millions dying. He ordered them to continue. He sealed the borders to trap people in the death zone. He kept exporting grain while villages starved. That's not a famine. That's genocide by starvation. The complete history of the Holodomor is the history of how a government can murder millions of people, deny it for decades, and face no international consequences. Stalin died in 1953 without facing justice. The Soviet officials who implemented the Holodomor continued their careers. The Communist Party that ordered the starvation remained in power until 1991. And Russia, as the Soviet Union's successor state, still denies it was genocide. 4 to 7 million Ukrainians dead. Entire villages erased. A generation destroyed. Families that resorted to cannibalism to survive. And the response from the perpetrators was denial, cover-up, and continued repression. Walter Duranty lied to the world and won a Pulitzer Prize. Gareth Jones told the truth and died mysteriously. Western intellectuals praised Stalin while Ukrainians starved, and for decades, the world pretended it didn't happen. That's the Holodomor, the terror famine, the genocide by starvation, the mass murder the Soviet Union denied and Russia still won't acknowledge. It's why Ukraine fights today, because they know what happens when Russia controls their fate. They've seen it before. They watched their people starve while the world looked away. And they refuse to let it happen again. The complete history of the Holodomor is a history of deliberate mass murder, systematic denial, and the world's failure to hold perpetrators accountable. Stalin wanted to crush Ukrainian resistance and fund industrialization. So he starved millions. He called it progress. He called it collectivization. He called it building socialism. It was genocide. And the fact that Russia still denies it proves nothing has fundamentally changed. 4 to 7 million dead, deliberately starved, while the grain they grew was exported for profit, while the world was told everything was fine, while journalists who reported the truth were discredited and killed. That's the Holodomor. The genocide by starvation that Stalin committed, the Soviet Union denied, and Russia still won't acknowledge. And it's why Ukrainians will never stop fighting for independence. Because the alternative is rule by a state that killed millions of them and pretends it never happened. That's not ancient history. That's a warning. And Ukraine is making sure the world finally listens.